Protesters have been gathering all over the world against racism and police brutality, owing to the death of George Floyd, who died as a result of police brutality in Minneapolis now almost 2 weeks ago. According to the BBC, George, the African-American male of 46 years old, was unarmed, and his only crime was an allegedly false $20 bill. However, he was arrested with all the force of the police because of the racial prejudice. This is not the first time racism has called attention to the imperfect system of the United States. For Black and minority ethnic people, the country has always been the America of an immune police force, white supremacy, and a legal system that protects only those who can afford it. But what was the impact these events had inside the neighbor country? What happens in Mexico? Are we racist? The problem with racism in Mexico is that it is not noticeable, as it is often mistaken with classism. As a result, it is harder to fight against it, as most Mexicans assume that there isn't racism in Mexico while acting racist without acknowledging it. One of the detonators of racism in Mexico was the racial category label system during the colonial times, which established distinctions between people according to their origin and gave a position of prestige to people of European origins, like the Spanish and whiter people, whereas discriminating the African and indigenous population. Nowadays, racism resides fundamentally in the media. Publicity and marketing avoids using people with darker skin in their ads. According to the CONAPRED, more than half of the population in Mexico consider themselves dark-skinned, and yet Mexican TV shows and ads don't reflect this. Most models that appear in television are blonde, white, or, as called by publicists, international Latin Americans. In Mexico, success is strictly linked to the color of your skin. Studies from the CONAPRED revealed that white people are more likely to have better jobs, better education, and better socioeconomical level, while dark-skinned people, the members of indigenous communities, or Afro-ascendant people, are prone to live within poverty levels. It is very common to see people get discriminated by their height, their color of their skin, or their socioeconomical level. That is why it is very difficult to differentiate between racism and classism inside our region. Is racism about what you believe, or is it about how you behave with other ethnics? Understanding racism is an important start to eradicate it. The main base of racism is prejudice, which assumes that something you think to be true for a whole group applies to every individual member of that group, with little or no evidence at all. Negative stereotypes are often directed at people who are different from yourself, which means that people who are a minority in a population are more likely to be negatively stereotyped. But how can this be applied in Mexico if more than half of the population has dark skin? That is not a minority. Racism includes beliefs, thoughts, and actions based on the idea that one race is innately superior to another race. The problem here is that in Mexico, we don't have races, so how can we be racist? We can argue that in this case, racism is inherently tied up to structures of power, meaning that racism specifically refers to the belief that a race with less societal power is inferior to other races. But of course, we also have to consider that we have explicit racism or implicit racism. It is easy to recognize an explicit act of racism, like calling someone a racial insult, but we often don't consciously recognize how implicit biases affect how we interact with each other. It might be easier to identify racism, prejudice, and discrimination in acts such as what happened to George Floyd. But what about that discrimination that we are not able to see, like the fact that dark-skinned people are more likely to suffer from the lack of access to quality housing, food, healthcare, or schooling? So, are we Mexicans any different than our neighbor? It turns out no. We must challenge anything that looks like it might be racist. We have to educate in order to unveil racism and eradicate it. We need a truly pluralistic society where the economic and social resources are distributed regardless of the heritage of their population and the color of their skin.